So I've been working on something. I wanted to get some feedback, so thank you very much for anybody that's willing to listen and give some feedback here. So I have something that already exists. This is this whole registered event builder idea for a plugin. This is something that lots of people have do it in different ways, but it's just a way to call out what function should get called based on the context. So in pre-operation update for this Acme inspection entity, then we should go ahead and call this this method. If you have a custom method, you can create a custom method. So if you have a create and update and you want to have different method calls, you can define those for different method calls. So I've already had that, and that works great. What I want to add, and what I'm adding here, is a way to declare when you actually need to process this plugin. Okay, so the idea for this plugin is when a inspection entity is updated and either the property is set or the engineer is set, we need to go and check to see if the engineer requires to have additional oversight by a more senior engineer depending on the property type. Okay, so the system user has a custom oversight required types. That lists the property types that are requiring that system engineer is going to require to have oversight of. And then the property on the inspection has a property type, and that property type will be used to figure out, hey, if that property type is included in the list of property types that senior engineer review is required of, then update the inspection to say, hey, the senior engineer review is required. So review is needed. So that's all this plugin's doing. It's not too complicated, but the part that I'm trying to simplify is the idea of going through and checking to see if the context actually needs the plugin to fire. So for example, I've gone through and defined that I need at least one of these properties to be updated. The property ID and then the engineer ID. And so I've defined that in a requirement validator. Again, naming conventions. Maybe this is horrible. Maybe we need to change this. But the requirement validator, and I pass that validator into my builder. It says, hey, for this particular event or this context, go ahead and call this validator. And it will go through and it will inspect based on the target and the pre-entity, because this is at least when updated, it will ensure that these values have been changed and updated to a different value than what exists in the system. So if you set the property to the same exact property, it won't run. It will say, oh, nothing's changed. Or same thing with the engineer. But if you set it to a different one, and if you set any of these things, it will run. If you set all of them, it'll run. If you don't set any of these things, and none of these things actually change, or they get set to a null value, then don't run. Then same thing with required is we're going to require, and I'm going to coalesce the target and the preimage. So it's going to say, hey, either it's in the target or it's in the preimage. We're going to require that it has it's in the result of the target coalesced with the preimage, meaning that if the target nulls it out, it won't be there. It won't run. But hey, I need the property ID and the engineering ID needs to be set as well. So this is enforcing that when I coalesce and I get the actual value out, they aren't null. And this is enforcing both of these aren't null. And this is enforcing that at least one of these is different than what it was before the plugin actually fired. So, and there's a couple of options here as well. So there's also, there's at least one required, which I just showed. Actually, no, at least one required is slightly different. That's basically like the all required, only, hey, only one of them is required. So I need this or that. All required, I just showed that one. All updated. So if you only want to run if multiple fields update, enforce that, you can do that. At least one updated, that's one I already showed. At least one required, allow nulls. That means that, hey, if they and this is primarily that kind of target. If it is there and it has a null value, that's okay. By default, it says, hey, if it is set to null explicitly, then it won't actually trigger. It'll prevent it from running. But in this case, yeah, if it is a null value, it will run. So, depending on what you need it for. And then same thing for this other allow nulls. All required, allow nulls. All updated, allow nulls. It's the same thing. We're saying, hey, a null value is a valid value for this plugin to run. That kind of stuff. So, and you can add as many of these as you want to that. So you can say, hey, at least one from this group is updated, and at least one from maybe some other group is updated. Whatever other value you want to add to that thing, I guess. Yeah, at least that one's updated. So you can put in whatever ones you want, and it'll treat those as groups. So that's kind of the idea here. So A, what do you think? B, what do you think about the names of it? Requirement validator seems kind of interesting. Like it's really defining, if it doesn't actually, these things don't hold true, it's not going to run. So it's a enforcer of actually needing the plugin to run, as well as being in a state that's valid for it to run. And so this way it's easy to go through and look at like, oh, well, I know that I'm going to need a pre-entity on this thing and this thing. And if you create no pre-entity, it will actually error because you've defined it, hey, this is required. It'll actually error and give you a message, a pre-entity is required with these two property names. So it's smart enough to do that. And all this is handled by the plugin-based class that'll run that and give a message, hey, the requirement validator failed, and it will skip execution. So it'll log that information as well, so you can see everything that's going on. So thoughts, feedbacks, and then especially names. What names kind of make sense? Is a requirement validator a good name? Is there a better name that I'm thinking of? This coalescing stuff, it just goes with whatever my context coalescing idea is. That, hey, take whatever is in the target and then add to it anything that's in the pre-entity that's not in the target. So, that made sense at the time I wrote it. I think it still makes sense, but so I'm reusing it here because you can say, I care about the pre-image, I care about the post-image, I care about the coalescing the post-image, or just the post-image, or just the pre-image, or just the target. You can specify whatever particular values are that you care about for the required option, as well as any of the things that aren't the updated. So at least one required, all required, at least one required, allow nulls, and all required, allow nulls. Those all will require you to go through and specify this context entity type. What type in the entity, what entity in the context do we actually care about? So anyway, feel free to comment on the video and let me know what your thoughts are. I appreciate it. And with that, I bid you adieu.